I recently came across this word, and I liked it, because the more I think about it, the more I realize it's giving me a much richer way to structure my imagination about the future of ecology than anything else I've come across. Things like conservation or any kind of organic practice or rewilding are often way too narrow in their focus. But what the idea of Soilpunk is letting me do is widen that focus. From thinking about just how to reforest a bit of land, to imagining what a full and fleshed out lifestyle would look like within that land. If you know me at this point, you know that I don't really expect any genuine solution to come out of any modern green movement. Not because I think they're wrong, but because I think facing what's coming is going to ask way more of us than we want it to. And that short sight is keeping us a bit stuck in trying to adapt technology to fit our lifestyles instead of adapting our lifestyles to figure out what's actually sustainable. And when it comes to the kinds of adaptations that will be necessary to survive the unpredictability of the future, superficial changes won't be enough. We need something that touches on everything from ecology to technology to psychology and culture as a whole. And even though I couldn't say what those specific changes should be, because I don't know what they should be, the backdrop of Soilpunk makes it easier to imagine. So I want to look at the artistic genre of Soilpunk. What is it not, and what should be its defining characteristics? If you are familiar with the concept of punk as a genre, feel free to skip this little section because you won't be getting anything new here. But for those of you who aren't, let's take a quick look at how we got here. First off, there's a lot of different kinds of punk. We started with cyberpunk, where the word punk was an attempt at referencing the punk aesthetic and its counter-cultural revolt against traditional Western society. If you've ever seen the movie Blade Runner, that's considered the quintessential example of what cyberpunk is, for its depiction of a world corrupted by an over-reliance on technology without care for the needs of people. Since then, the suffix punk has evolved to where it doesn't keep much of that original energy. It's lost that revolt, and it's kind of used as a way to describe any story set in a civilization that's progressed differently to our own. And usually that progress is conceptualized around a particular technology, which has given us everything from steampunk, which lets us imagine worlds set in a late Victorian era where high technology is still powered by steam, to atompunk, in which atomic energy is central to the story along with the paranoia of the Cold War dominating social relationships, and solarpunk, which lets us imagine hopeful futures in which current problems are resolved by a society run on renewable energy. Now, in the case of soilpunk, as you can expect, the singular technology, for lack of a better word, that shapes the world is soil. Chances are most of you have never heard the word before, because not many people have. At the moment, it doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry, just a small literary journal, a video game that isn't out yet, and a random article I suspect was written by AI. So the way I see it, what soilpunk is actually still up for debate, which for me is awesome because it means that this video can be more of a proposal than a strict definition. It can be me, someone who's accidentally been living a light version of soilpunk for over a decade, floating some ideas of what I think it should become, which is a genre that helps us imagine a future in which our attention is centered where it belongs, in the dirt beneath our feet, and that goes beyond just letting us see that future to providing us with a real way to get there. Now, at first glance, it might seem very similar to something like solarpunk, and you might be wondering if they're different enough to warrant a whole new genre, but I do think they've got some meaningful differences. Because while it's interesting to see something like solarpunk present a future where renewable energy runs everything, at the end of the day, things like renewable energy don't matter if you don't have soil. If we don't produce electricity, we might get cold in winter or bored when our phones don't turn on, but we'd survive. If we don't have soil, though, we don't eat. So soilpunk invites us to take a step back and imagine a world where we actually treat soil and all of nature with respect and care, because if we don't, that's the end. So attention to soil becomes the foundation for everything. which means that what Soilpunk is looking to affect is anything that's affecting the planet's soil, and it'll go anywhere if it leads us to living within what soil can provide, or developing the skills necessary to care for soil. Now, I know that's still a pretty broad definition, and I do want to get a bit more specific a bit later on, but first, I think it'll be helpful to get a bit of context from what I think Soilpunk is not. The current thinking on what Soilpunk should be says that it's a hopeful genre, that it should focus on depictions of people who have figured out how to live in harmony with nature in a way that respects what soil can provide and inspires us to believe in a positive future. But I'm pretty adamant that that's not what Soilpunk should be. Because while imagining stories where we figure out how to live in harmony with nature is important, and it lets us feel a spark of our own decency and capacity to positively affect the world, which is something people need, I don't think it actually accomplishes the goal that Soilpunk is setting out to accomplish, which is that beyond the goal of just entertaining us, Soilpunk should propel real people in the real world to take real action for the benefit of soil. And a focus on hope doesn't quite get us there. Not by itself. I can imagine depressing stories that do more than hopeful ones to that end. I think there's much more to learn from imagining a village that's accepted that the damage we've caused to soil, and to the whole planet, is too large. And the story is about learning how to die well as we try to minimize the time it'll take Earth to turn around and be vibrant again after human beings have gone. Seeing that very real possibility play out can do much more to inspire people to action than showing us surviving happily. And don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with hopeful depictions. I'm just saying that focusing on hope does us a disservice, because we should be inspiring people in all the different ways that different people might be inspired. And while for some people that's hope, for others it's anger, frustration, disgust, impotence. Sometimes what we need, even if we don't like it, is to feel the utter bleakness that might be waiting for us if we don't succeed in changing our lives. Second, another current view on Soilpunk is that it should be oriented towards envisioning solutions to the problems of our day. Another thing I really think should not be the case. For me, Soilpunk is about imagining lifestyles where we live respectfully with soil. It's about the inherent nobility and goodness of a life that respects nature. Not because it'll get us something, not because it'll solve problems that allow us to continue living comfortable lives, but because it's a good way to live. And of course it can result in solutions, but that shouldn't be the point. In fact, I'd say most of the time it's way more important to show that a lot of problems don't have solutions, and what's needed is to confront them. I think instead of depicting any particular place we're supposed to end up, Soilpunk should be much more about learning to navigate hardship, training ourselves to widen our view of what's necessary, even when that brings us in directions we don't like. Because chances are there's a lot about the future we're not going to like. And that opens the door for stories that I'd call important, like imagining a group of scientists who've discovered that it's impossible to ethically create renewable energy. That the damage it causes to the environment through mining, transport, manufacturing, and storage will always be too high to justify. And what they have to do is unwillingly, but consciously, move away from living with most electricity. It would let us experience how they hate every step of the process, but do it anyway. Not because it solves anything, but because it's the right choice. That absolute bummer of a story, in my eyes, would be massively Soilpunk. And no, I'm not advocating for a life without electricity. I'm trying to come to terms with the fact that if we actually figure out a way to respond to climate change, there will most likely be a lot of parts of our lifestyle that we'll have to let go of. Parts that today seem unthinkable to live without. And that process is going to suck. Because after all, the way you make new soil is by letting things die. Now, getting back to what Soilpunk is. I wanted to give you an example that would really cement the picture in your imagination, but as far as I know, there's no one story that completely encapsulates the aesthetic and worldview of it. So what I thought might be nice here is a kind of collage. where I'll talk about the defining characteristics of what I think a genre born out of respect for soil would look like, and then highlight those elements as closely as I can find in other stories. And hopefully like that, we can stitch something together that kind of looks like Soilpunk. And one last note before we get going. I am going to try and talk about some of these stories without spoilers, but some of the exact details I need to talk about are pretty spoily, so if that sort of thing bothers you, feel free to skip some sections. I think it's pretty important to see Soilpunk goes way beyond just soil, because when you start to trace out what can become soil, or what soil can become, you quickly get to everything. Everything, including people, is soil. So what I think that means for Soilpunk is we need to learn how to care for the base building block of most life by caring for all life. So it's not just about soil as a thing, but about getting to understand how linked we are to soil on a daily basis. I'd like to see people being a part of nature. Not a part, but a part. Instead of watching from a distance, ready to step in if the situation calls for it, I think it's important to see people with dirty fingernails discover ecology from within an ecosystem. I'm remembering the scene from the movie Only Yesterday when Taiko is visiting her family in rural Japan, and she makes this comment about how natural everything is. And her friend, who's a farmer, has to tell her that what she's seen, the river, the forests, and the dam, they're not natural. They are an artifact of human involvement. And what's noteworthy about that to me isn't that people are supposed to be influencing everything, or that things should look like rural Japan. There's a subtler understanding that when people live in a good way among nature, they can influence the world around us positively, and come to rely more directly on nature. And vice versa, nature can come to rely more directly on us. And in that way, landscapes become a kind of co-creation between us and nature. But that comes with a caveat, because to get to a place where it's really a co-creation, you need to understand what it is nature needs, and currently, I don't think that's something we're very good at. If our goal is to explore worlds that respect soil, I think we need to understand soil first. And right now, I don't think we do. Our science on soil is lacking, and our treatment of soil is based on domination and control. Even among projects that are regenerating soil, our tendency is to use soil however we like, because for most people, soil is a dead thing that has no will of its own, and that shows. I think if we're going to get anywhere here, we need to care about what soil wants, and that's a lot easier to do when soil has a voice. So I'd like to see stories that talk to soil, or at least try to talk to any part of nature, even if we don't know what soil is saying back to us. Signaling that we acknowledge that nature has a will, and that we want to understand or learn to listen to that will, is vital. I'd like to see our relationship to soil reshaped through curiosity and conversation. And as for what that might look like in practice, it can be done 1,000 different ways, but I like how the Avatar movies do it, with the way the Na'vi can connect with trees and horses to tap into the consciousness of the world, where they're connected in a way where they can talk to and feel each other, and the result of that communication is a culture that understands the inherent aliveness of everything and refuses to exploit the dignity of the planet. When it comes to collaborating with soil, though, I don't think that's something we're ready to do well just yet. Most people, myself included, think they're collaborating with soil when really they're actually running around doing whatever they want, which doesn't make for a good collaboration. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that people aren't doing good things with soil. They can be. I'm saying that most of the time people are just doing whatever they think is right, independent of whatever it would be that soil wants. And consent is important even when it comes to soil, because without it you don't have a relationship, not a beneficial one at that. You've got a relationship between a master and a servant. So what I'd like to see here is people figuring out what that sort of equal relationship would look like, where what we want and what nature wants are weighed together. And instead of a story here, I actually think the best place to learn what that looks like is directly from soil. Honestly, there's no better role model for this, because there's no center in soil. Soil isn't one thing. Soil is a collection of a series of interactions. There's remnants of plant matter and animals mixed with old degraded stones of all sizes. There's water and air floating around in there. There's habitat for trillions of little bugs and mushrooms, and bacteria and archaeobacteria and all sorts of other little things. And if any one of those elements are missing or start to become overrepresented, the whole system starts to collapse. So I'd like to see us learn to emulate that state of relationship, where the best conditions for growth don't come from directing things to go how we want them to be, or giving all our attention to any particular individual element, but in allowing there to be a healthy balance between individual elements and a community, and where we accept that we are not in control, and the best thing we can do with our attention is invest it into responding to the fluid and changing conditions of an ecosystem, is understanding and fostering what it is that that web of relationship wants. If we're being honest with ourselves, there's not much overlap between what we're willing to do, capable of doing, and what soil needs from us. Most of us are so focused on our own comfort and security that we end up ignoring most of the ways our lives harm soil. We're all too glad to keep turning a blind eye to the abuses of soil and each other if it means we can keep our individual lifestyles going. If you think about it, how many people do you know who would actively put the well-being of their backyard or local park above their own? At this point, I've met hundreds of people dedicated to or interested in land care, and I don't think a single one of them would live up to that. Myself included, by the way. We talk a big game, but none of us are actually living like what's good for the land is what's good for us. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is that any regeneration of soil that doesn't include a regeneration of us as people is doomed to fail. Because you can't regenerate soil in one pioneering, amazing project while you're destroying soil in 10 other places. The fact is, we can't continue our culture as it is today into the future. We can't just make some compost and call it a day. Our lifestyles are just too damaging. There needs to be a shift where we make all the cultural, psychological, economic, interpersonal, whatever changes to our relationship with soil. Because harm to soil is coming from all directions. And it's going to take a special kind of curiosity and care to regenerate all that. One that goes well beyond this basic desire to fix things that you'll find in a lot of detective stories or shows about doctors, because there's usually something missing in there. Something I've seen best represented, but not perfectly represented, in the anime Mushishi. Mushi are a hidden form of life who the majority of people can't see. Most of the time, Mushi go about their lives without causing any problems, but every now and again, they can become imbalanced. And that can result in problems ranging anywhere from taking away someone's sight to taking away a whole village's capacity to grow crops. And Ginkgo is a kind of doctor who specializes in Mushi. He travels between villages trying to understand those imbalances, and as best as he can, he sets things right. What I think is missing from a lot of detective stories that Ginkgo has is that his concern is very slow and very patient. Well beyond what most of us would find practical. Sometimes he'll wait around with someone for a month, or come back year after year to the same problem if it means he'll be there with you at the right moment to figure out what's happening. He understands that to find the root cause of a problem, he has to follow its threads wherever they lead. He can't just act on symptoms, because unless you find the root cause, the problem will just keep poking its head up. So he doesn't rush in and try stuff out the moment he thinks he knows what the problem is. Even when he's fairly certain of something, he's constantly counseling people to slow down and learn as much as they can about a subject, to get as much detail as they can find before they act. Change by itself is not easy, especially for people who've been raised in an age of absolute comfort and convenience, and when that change is geared towards moving you somewhere less secure. and where the alternative to that Instagram vision of carefree success is a bunch of effort that might lead nowhere. And then beyond just change is meaningful change, which most of the time is really uncomfortable. And it's exactly the same with soil. Working with soil, as opposed to how I might make it seem sometimes, is not easy. And having to live within what soil can provide is uncomfortable. I think it's really important to show that this whole process of working with soil is not a cakewalk. And it takes a certain kind of personality to flourish within that. It takes a bit of losing any expectation that things will go your way or be easy. It takes someone like Ashitaka from Princess Mononoke, who will walk into any struggle if it's the right thing to do, who doesn't let picking sides hold him back. Wherever it leads, whoever it puts him into conflict with, even if it kills him, he'll do it. So what I want to see is that life is inconvenient and messy, and that things take longer than expected, and I want to see how the true cost of things is way more than I'm willing to pay. I want to see when things are ugly, even when I love them. I want it to be the case that instead of glorifying success, we can glorify rising to a challenge, even if we fail. Which again is not easy. Because I think Soilpunk is not about a path to safety, or some miracle future where everyone has everything they need. It's not about people smiling from their gardens showing you what they grew that summer. It's people with weight on their shoulders who've put in months of work and who still find a way to joke when the cabbages don't grow in as well as they thought they might. I think it's really important that Soilpunk be grounded in the real world. And for that to work, it's important to not only show a vision of the future, but to have a strategy for how to get from here to there. As for me, I think every path there needs to go through a process of confronting and then overcoming the colonial heart of our collective lifestyle. There's no Soilpunk without it. Now, as for what coloniality is, that would need a whole video to itself, and there's too many people who could do a much better job of that than me, so I'm not going to try for the moment. But I will say that the result of all that coloniality is a world in which we can't get away from the ever-increasing isolation, exploitation, and domination that it creates. When what Soilpunk needs are relationships based on permission. So what I'd like to see are stories like Steven Universe, which even though it's for kids, is a pretty excellent decolonial guide. It's a show that starts off like most kids' shows used to, with a monster of the week that has to be defeated. As Steven grows, it becomes a story about a young boy who discovers that his talents don't lie in his ability to beat someone up, but in protecting and healing the people he cares about. Over time, he figures out that his family, and in some ways he himself, has literally colonized the universe. And the central drama of the whole show becomes two things. First, Steven trying to take responsibility for the harm he's caused, and second, trying to undermine his family's tyrannical order. And beyond that, after he succeeds, there's also a whole season just to deal with the trauma of having been through such an intense process. It is, beginning to end, a story of unraveling the colonial tendencies within ourselves. And it does some pretty important things. It acknowledges that those great problems we see out in the world start within ourselves, while also acknowledging that those things out in the world need to be resisted. It succeeds through compassion and caring for the marginalized. It lets go of hierarchical strategies of violence, control, and exploitation, and replaces them with horizontal structures based on permission, curious connection, and empathy. I also want to talk about technology, because even though most punk aesthetics tend to center the technologies possible within that vision of the world, here, soil, most of the time, is a pretty tame thing that doesn't immediately lend itself to high-tech visions of the future. Which puts us in a weird place when it comes to the physical tools we use. Because on the one hand, we want to develop technology that allows us to thrive, but on the other, we want to make sure we're not forgetting about soil in the process. And much more than we'd like to admit, the tools we use end up doing a lot more harm than we know what to do with. So, we don't want to destroy soil or ecosystems, but we need tools to survive. And as much as I'd like it to be true, you can't do that with just sticks and stones, or even with just scythes and sickles. So when it comes to navigating that, I found it helpful to take a page out of the book of the Amish. Now, I'm not saying I want to live like the Amish or agree with a lot of what they believe, but they are doing something pretty cool. Because in case you don't know, the Amish aren't against new technology. There's Amish with tractors and phones and solar panels. From what I understand, most Amish will try any new technology that they think might help them. But what they're looking for when they do isn't whether or not it's more efficient or comfortable. What they're looking at is how it affects them as a community, as parents, as friends. They're looking to see if it leads to richer connections between people. Because if it doesn't, they'll send it back. Little side note here, I would definitely watch some Amish punk if it existed, because there's a lot to learn there. Like how we could be technologically suspicious. And instead of accepting any new gadget we find, we could ask some questions. Like, 1. Does this technology improve our lives by making us more connected, resilient, and fulfilled? Or is it just another convenience? 2. How does it impact all the other characteristics we've talked about? Does it stoke our privilege and result in a more colonial approach to problems? Or does it pull us down into the mud and make us more likely to rely on our neighbor? And 3. Being as honest and circumspect as we can be, is it actually possible to bring in this new technology and not harm nature in the process? Does it actually do more good than harm? I think only when you've got all of the characteristics we've talked about until now in place can you start to trust that the changes you'll make won't loop you right back to where you started, carelessly exploiting the planet for your own benefit. And that makes the end goal of Soilpunk a search for ways of life that don't do that, and makes the kind of technology that Soilpunk experiments freely with mostly cultural. It's in trying things out like non-hierarchical societies or communities who value emotional maturity over intellect, maybe even a gift economy or who knows what else. What's important here isn't any particular idea or way of being, but figuring out ways of life that fulfill us, that soil can actually support, and that are suited to the particularities of the landscapes we live in. And I think that's what being local really means. Being local isn't just getting your groceries from within a 15-minute drive. It's in figuring out what a culture looks like when one's lifestyle reflects the environments we live in, which will mean that every village will be somewhat different. Everything from what holidays are celebrated to the customs and technologies that are seen as acceptable would change depending on where you live. Because what's necessary for people living up in the mountains isn't the same as what's needed down on the coast. Life in each of those places asks something different of us, and evolve a different morality and ethos. Here I like the style used by old sci-fi series. Things like Star Trek, Doctor Who, and The Twilight Zone that present you with all these little visions of differing norms, opinions, and beliefs. They brought you to these other worlds where it's clear that the way one is expected to think, feel, and act are fundamentally different from our own, and where what it means to be a good person isn't what we'd expect. Really, what I'm looking for is a story that gets us away from this one singular monolithic form of life we've been shoehorned into, and that helps us splinter into different visions of what a good Soilpunk life would look like. And there you have it, a bunch of pieces that individually don't look like much, but when you piece them together, create Soilpunk. We've got a respect for nature, along with a sense of how alive nature is. We've got a desire to make relationships central to the way we navigate the world, along with an understanding that a lot more than we think needs to be regenerated before we can actually inhabit those relationships. There's a desire to move towards the discomfort of change, as well as a decolonial framework to guide us through that change. And finally, an exploration of the technology and cultures that would allow each of us to make Soilpunk our own. Thanks for listening.